Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our webinar this morning on organic low tunnel strawberry production. Today, speaking with us, we have Marvin Pritts here from Cornell University. I just want to note that this webinar is supported by the USDA Transition to Organic Partnership Program, or the TOP program. In South Dakota, the TOP program is administered by the Organic Crop Improvement Association, or OCIA, under a cooperative agreement to South Dakota Specialty Producers Association. And Dr. Jackson will talk in just a minute about more that program offers, but it aims to support farmers in transitioning to organic. We have 1 hour and 15 minutes set aside for this webinar with time for questions at the end. So please feel free to use the Q&A feature or the chat if you want to send in your questions during the presentation, and we will do our best to have them all answered. And with that, we'll turn it over to Dr. Jackson first.
Yeah, thank you, Morgan. And for those who are watching this will be recorded and will be made available on the South Dakota Specialty Producers YouTube page. So if you don't get a chance to watch the whole thing through, I recommend checking back with us in our YouTube page in a few days, and it should be posted up there. The Plains Transition to Organic Partnership Program is a coalition of organizations that provide technical assistance and wraparound support for transitioning and existing farmers. It serves Colorado, Kansas, Nebraska, North and South Dakota, and Oklahoma. The South Dakota Specialty Producers Association is a partner within the Plains region, and our goal is to connect operators with transitioning to organic local experts, as well as experienced organic operators, as well as those who serve as mentors and help us to be more knowledgeable on different organic production practices, such as our speaker today, Marvin Pritts, who's going to be speaking with us about organic strawberry production. We also provide assistance on organic certification, conservation planning, the organic regulations, certification cost share programs, as well as different types of business development and marketing opportunities. So if you are interested, after the presentation today, if you're interested in starting an organic strawberry production on your own farm or your own land, we would be happy to connect with you to provide technical assistance and support for that program. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Marvin Pritts. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Angela. It's nice to be with all of you. So we're going to spend the next amount of time talking about growing strawberries under low tunnels and organically, if possible. So I'm going to give you like a big overview of what we're trying to do, and then I'll go into the details and try to answer the questions about how it's done. So the first thing is we're looking at season extension here. We don't want strawberries for 3 weeks anymore. We want strawberries for 4 or 5 months over the entire season. And to do that, we have to use day-neutral strawberries. So here's a field of day-neutral strawberries, cultivar Albion. This is actually in Quebec, Canada. But what we do, we take these strawberries before they get to this stage, before August, and we put hoops up over the plants, and we cover them with some sort of material like plastic or so forth. And that allows us to start picking strawberries relatively soon, and we can continue into the fall. So this time of the year, our day-neutral strawberries are under these tunnels, and the size can be lowered or raised depending on the temperature and depending on the weather. So we can lower the sides when frost is expected or when heavy rains are expected, and raise them when it gets warm, because we want these plants to be at that optimal temperature range of, say, between 55 and 80, so they continue to flower and fruit. And we can go into November and pick strawberries even when there's snow out, because they're covered and protected. So this is our goal, and we're also doing it pretty much organically. And we'll talk about the biggest challenges for organic production. But most of the things I'm going to talk about relate to conventional and or organic production. So that's the big picture. And when you use these tunnels, to grow the strawberries under, you pretty much eliminate your diseases. We don't get gray mold because it doesn't rain on the plants, and we don't get powdery mildew. So it's really a great environment for these strawberry plants to grow. And you can also hold these plants over into the second year. So you plant them the first year, and because they're day neutral, they'll flower and fruit that first year. There's another great thing about these plants. So you don't have to wait a whole year before they produce fruit. So you can plant them in, say, April or May, and start harvesting fruit in July, August, September, October, even into November. And then you can overwinter them, and they'll produce some fruit the following spring as well. This technique of using tunnels and strawberries is caught on all over the world. I just thought this was interesting. This is Spain and Africa to the south there. And then you see over here starting to be the Mediterranean Sea, and this is the Atlantic Ocean. And then in Spain here, I've circled this little spot here that kind of looks white. And what we're going to do is we're going to drill down, get a little bit closer to that white area, get a little bit closer, a little bit closer. And this area here is full of tunnels. And in those tunnels are strawberries, which are grown for season extension. So this part of the Spain produces strawberries during the winter for Northern Europe. In our situation here, we haven't really used those high tunnels so much as low tunnels. And this is an example of low tunnels with these day neutral strawberries. And the low tunnels are a lot cheaper than a high tunnel. So it's about a fourth the cost to cover the same amount of area. So it's a little bit more difficult to manage because you have to open and close those tunnels. And it's easier to do when it's just one great big tunnel, but it's a lot cheaper. Generally, what we do is we have these tunnels open for most of the year, but we pull the sides over whenever it's going to rain, and then also when it gets cold. So that's the big picture. That's kind of what we're aiming for. And there's a lot of questions still to be answered. Well, how do you do that? What are the details of that? And here's all the questions here you can look at, and I'm not going to read these off to you one by one, but we're going to try to answer most of these questions by looking at the results of some of our experiments and what we've tried to figure out. So the first obvious question people have is, well, what variety should I use? What cultivars are best for our colder climates? And typically, strawberries are pretty picky about where they grow and where they do well. Like, for example, we don't grow a lot of European varieties here, and they don't grow a lot of ours over there. Same way with Japanese varieties. Even California varieties tend not to do well outside of California because they're bred specifically for those areas. But there seems to be some exceptions with some of these day neutral strawberries, particularly Albion. So we've tried a bunch of day neutral strawberries, and the Albion variety is the one that probably gives us the most consistent yield and has the best flavor, and people really like it. Some of these other varieties don't taste as good. They taste more like your standard California varieties, but Albion has a lot of flavor. And even though it's not as high yielding, that's what we're going with. And even though this is an old variety now, there are a lot of newer California day neutral strawberries that have come out. None of them really taste as good and perform as well as Albion. It seems to me that if you're going to be producing strawberries for the market, you don't want to produce a strawberry that tastes just like the one you can get in a grocery store. You want to produce something that tastes really good to get people coming back and take advantage of that local market. So we're going with Albion in most of our work. And then so putting up these low tunnels, is that worthwhile? I mean, it takes money and effort to do that. But we have a lot of data now from lots of different places that show you almost always get higher yield and higher quality when you grow your berries under a tunnel. Here are some of those California day neutral strawberries, the yield in the tunnel and the yield in the open. And like almost every case, the yield under the tunnel is higher than the yield in the open. In fact, every case. And the percent of marketable berries is also higher under the tunnels than out in the open. So on average, in this one trial, in this one experiment, 27% higher yields and 50% higher marketable fruit under low tunnels, and we harvested all the way up until November 15th. We also held these plants over into a second year to see how they would do. And again, huge differences between in the tunnel and in the open. In the tunnel and the open. In the same way with the percent marketable fruit, when it's in the open, it's exposed to the rain, insects, and everything like that. But under the tunnel, you get a lot more protection. So quite a bit higher percent yields under the tunnel and higher percent marketable fruit. Now you notice I should go back. The harvest season is shorter. We're not going to November. This is because it's a second year. And in the second year, the plants produce fruit early, almost the same time as regular strawberries, and then they kind of peter out. So we've never held our denatured strawberries beyond that first flush of fruit in that second year. And this is an experiment done at a grower trial where we looked at the yields under the tunnel and outside the tunnel. Again, huge differences. The covering really makes a difference in the yield. Well, then question is, what kind of plastic is best? There's all kinds of plastics out there. Some inhibit infrared, some inhibit ultraviolet, some don't do either. So we want to look and see what kind of plastic works best on these hoops. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that plants absorb light under just really specific wavelengths. They absorb light in this visible light range here, mostly in the reds and in the blues. Green light isn't really absorbed that much, it's reflected off. So you want a plastic that allows a lot of transmission in this range here, which most transparent plastics do. Here's the thing though, if you look at fungi, oftentimes those spores don't respond to this wavelength of light here. They have an activity under different wavelengths. So if we go, and this is it, starting from 220 nanometers up to 340 or something like that, that's when those wavelengths of light stimulate spore germination, gray mold botrytis. And if you go back, we can see that spore germination happens to the left of this line here. So if we can come up with a plastic that transmits visible light but cuts off light in this area here where the botrytis is most active, that could also help us reduce some of the disease in these strawberries. And indeed, there's a plastic called HydroCool, HyCool, that does that same thing. You notice that right here, during the visible wavelengths of light, it's allowing full transmission, pretty much full transmission, 80% transmission, but then it drops off precipitously as we get into that range where the plants can't use, but the botrytis could, but that's shut down a lot. So this is like one approach to managing disease under these tunnels is pick a plastic that cuts off the wavelengths once you get below like 400 nanometers. We've looked at all kinds of plastics, IR diffusing plastics, no IR blocker, IR blocker, and we get these production curves that look like this. And really, to tell you the truth, there's not a real big difference between these plastics, at least in our experience. You can add these diffusers and so forth. That it doesn't make a difference. In theory, it looks like it should, but it really doesn't. But what we do notice is that at the end of the season, these plastics keep on going where the controls tend to shut down. So things kind of pick up a little bit in October into November. You kind of get another flush, and they seem to do better at the end of the year. And here's some example of some more work. This is looking at no tunnel, which is green, looking at a couple of these plastics. And there's not a big difference between the plastics, but you can see again at the end of the season, the plastics always do better than the open, and that allows you to keep on going a little bit with fruit. Here's an experiment of my colleagues. We sort of have this cooperative arrangement here in New Hampshire and Pennsylvania, and they've looked at all these different kinds of plastics too. Cool light, UVB, tough light, UVT, and again, there's not a lot of difference between the plastics. And in New Hampshire, they didn't find a big difference in the open in this particular year, but in Pennsylvania, they did. Again, all the plastics did about the same, but when you didn't have plastic, the yields fell off. That's typically what we see. And here's another example where we're looking at the percent fruit, marketable fruit, and again, a drop off where there's no tunnel. So yields go down and quality goes down without plastic. And here's just one harvest, looking at percent marketable fruit. And again, whenever you, this is New Hampshire, when you don't have a tunnel and you have a lot of rain, your yields just plummet and your quality of fruit plummets as well. So I'm hoping I make an argument that plastic tunnels are worth it for the yield improvement, the quality improvement, and the reduction in disease. We still have a bunch of questions to answer, like, when's the best time to plant these strawberries? So we did an experiment with 2 cultivars and looked at 4 planting dates, April and 2 in May and 1 in June, 15 days apart. And here's the experimental plot. We did this both in Ithaca and in Geneva, our experiment station up there. And you can see the plants at various stages of planting. And you can probably pick out the ones in the foreground that were planted in late April, and then the ones that were probably planted in June. And just a close-up of the plants. And this is typically what we do. We plant them on on white plastic, about in a staggered double row. The plants are about 12 inches apart on the stagger. So like every 6 inches, there'll be a plant to the left, another 6 inches to the right, back and forth all the way down. Put these hoops up, put the plastic on, put straw between the rows so you can kneel on it to pick. And this is looking at marketable yield. And again, the earliest planting date was the best, and it sort of fell off after that with Albion. Seascape, the same thing. The earliest planting date was the best. It fell off after that. And this is using bare root plants, the ones that come from the nursery in the bundles of 25. And this is looking at all the data together. And again, same thing, that April 30th planting date was always the best. And this is our results from Geneva. Same thing. They did a little bit earlier planting date. They have lighter soils they could get on earlier. But again, the earlier planting dates are always the best. Once you get into May, you'll start to fall off, and in June, they really drop off. So the bottom line from here is if you're going to use these day neutrals and plant, the earlier seems to be the best. Does ground mulch color make a difference? Should you use white? Should you use black? Should you use white on black? Again, this is some of my colleagues' work in New Hampshire and Pennsylvania. And they found that it doesn't really matter whether you use black or white on black. They do better than bare ground. In our experience, I like the white only because our white keeps the soil a little bit cooler and keeps the plants a little bit cooler. As our temperatures seem to be increasing with climate change, you want cooler rather than warmer. So the black will warm things up quickly in the spring, but then it gets hot under there in the summer. So white on black kind of maybe not get those plants off to quite as fast of a start, but then it's cooler during the time of the year they're fruiting. So I don't know if it matters a whole lot. I prefer white on black. But you can see from the data here, it doesn't make that big of a difference. One place where they did find a big difference was the number of runners that are produced. So one of the steps you have to take when you're growing these day neutrals, particularly on plastic, particularly on black plastic, is that heat stimulates runner production. And those really have to be clipped off because you don't want those plants that are already at a high density planted in there and running and those runners having to root. You just end up with a real mess. So you have to clip those runners a few times a year. So the fewer runners you have, the easier that job is. So again, white plastic does not stimulate as much running as black plastic. So another question we have, how much fertilizer and when? So we put out these research plots and we fertilize these plants at different rates once a week, and then harvested and looked at the yield. And essentially what we found is, as you might expect, yields go up with more fertilizer until you reach about 5 pounds of actual nitrogen per week. Then it kind of levels out. And we did a little bit of pre-plant fertilizer, and no pre-plant didn't really seem to make a difference, but there's definitely an increase here. And we've seen that over the years. They need, unlike a regular June strawberry where you can fertilize maybe 2 or 3 times a year, these plants really have to be spoon-fed, and they really like once a week to get 5 pounds of nitrogen. And I think this is probably the biggest challenge growing organically, because when you use inorganic fertilizers, you can dissolve that in the irrigation system and spread it out there pretty easily once a week. But when you're using organic fertilizers, they're a little bit less soluble. And if you're using drip tubes, it can sometimes clog up your drip lines. So I think with organic day nutrient production, you really have to build up the nitrogen before you plant. So like, again, a lot of compost and some manure, maybe something to build up that nitrogen, because you're not going to be able to spoon feed them as easily with an organic system as an inorganic system. So I think, at least in my opinion, that's been the biggest difference when we've tried to grow these organically, is struggling with getting enough nitrogen later in the season to keep the plants vigorous and going. Another important question is it worthwhile to overwinter the plants? I mentioned you can plant them in the spring, harvest them all summer long into the fall, and then what do? Do you just tear them up and start over again and grow them as an annual, or do you overwinter them and pick some fruit in the spring? So we did a trial where we looked at several different treatments. One was we didn't mulch them with straw, we just left them in the open. We mulched them really early in the fall with straw. We had a normal mulching time with straw, which is around Thanksgiving for us. We put row covers over them for winter protection. Another thing we did was we pinched the flowers off from October 1st on. And the reason for that was to build up their carbohydrates for winter, so they weren't putting those carbohydrates into fruit. They were putting them into the root and the crown to help them survive the winter. And then we also deflowered from August 15th on. Now, the downside of pinching the flowers from October 1st on is you don't have any more fruit. So you lose a little bit of yield when you do that, but maybe you can make up for it by improved overwintering. That's what we were looking for. And then we also looked at fertilizing the plants in the fall with foliar urea sprays and then normal mulching. The thing I should tell you about nitrogen in the fall is that it forces the plant to use its carbohydrates to take up that nitrogen. So when you apply fertilizer in the fall, you actually drive down carbohydrate levels. And if there's lots of carbohydrate in the plant, that's not a problem. But if the carbohydrate levels are low, it can draw those carbohydrates down to practically zero. And then the plants succumb to the cold weather, and because they don't have any carbon there to use to respire and support growth. So anyway, we had these 7 different treatments. And then this is our plots. And in the springtime, plants kind of, I don't know, they don't look great to me. We did get differences in these treatments. Here you can see some plants died, some plants, all the leaves are brown, as you would expect. Plants alive per treatment in the fall going into winter, they're almost, close to 100%. We're surviving going into the fall. Then coming out in the spring, there were some big differences here. Let's look at number 7 first. That was a weekly urea sprays. That's where we fertilized in the fall, and it drove down the carbohydrate levels, and those plants, just hardly any of them survived. We had like 1 out of 3 survive. On the other hand, where we use 2 sheets of row cover, that'd be number 3, and we let the light come through during the winter, but they still have some protection from the row cover, we had much better survival. And then 5 and 6, they didn't do too bad either. Those are the flower removal treatments. When we remove flowers in the fall to prevent them from fruiting and driving down carbohydrate levels, they also survive better. The problem with that is that you also you lose your October yield. So you pay a price for doing that, but you make that up in survival. This is the average marketable weight per fruit, kind of the same trends. Removing the flowers really boosted the size of the fruit the following spring. This one here, where we had the 2 sheets of row cover and let the light through, it was the only treatment where we could detect measurable amounts of carbohydrate in the springtime. All those other treatments, the carbohydrates in the crowns just went down to practically nothing. In terms of the soluble carbohydrate, number 3, where there was some light, allowed the carbohydrate to build up. But I would say, yeah, based on our experience, and I would guess too, maybe in South Dakota where it gets really cold in the winter, long winters, probably isn't worth it to overwinter your plants and go to all that trouble for just a little bit of yield in the spring at the same time regular strawberries are coming in. At least that's my hunch. And even in New York, where winters aren't quite as long or cold, I still don't know if it's worth it to overwinter them. So again, we're treating them as annuals. Again, this just shows how you pinch the flowers in October, you're going to lose yield. So probably the biggest pest problem on strawberries, at least insect pest problems, is tarnished plant bug. They love to feed on those strawberries, flowers, and their populations increase as the season goes on. So as you get closer to August and September, just when these day neutrals are really hitting their stride, you got a lot of tarnished plant bugs. And they're really hard to control. Even conventional growers that don't mind spraying spray a lot for these things. So we got to figure out maybe some better ways of controlling the tarnished plant bug. Like I say, it's probably the biggest pest. So we looked at, can we just exclude them? So we looked at some different size meshes, put it over the plants to see if to keep the tarnished plant bugs out. Of course, our hypothesis was we might be able to keep the tarnished plant bugs out, but maybe we're also keeping out the bees. So is there like an optimal size there? I'm not sure. Tarnished plant bugs are smaller than bees, so we weren't exactly sure what to expect. But we put these covers out under different mesh sizes. Some are pretty wide, some are like mosquito netting, some were plants were in the open. And then we harvested and looked at sizes and everything like that. There's a close-up of one of the wider net meshes that we looked at. And again, the fruit in the fall. Let me go back here. You can see this is like mosquito netting. It's really fine netting here. And I think what was surprising was those tight meshes, like that mosquito netting, it did keep out the tarnished plant bug. The marketable fruit increased, even though probably it was excluding bees too. So even though insects couldn't get in there, the plants were still being pollinated. In fact, the smallest mesh size gave us the best fruit, the best yield, and the best size. So I think, and this has been reported elsewhere, that albion can self-pollinate itself as long as there's a little bit of wind movement and so forth. So I think excluding tarnished plant bugs is certainly a strategy to use if you have a lot of problems with that. The other thing we find is that you don't want to, the pressure from tarnished plant bugs depends a lot on what's surrounding your field. And if you have a lot of, I don't know, grass or alfalfa or something around your strawberry field and you mow it, those tarnished plant bugs are going to fly into the strawberries. So you want to think about the landscape and what's around your strawberry field. All right, so another question, what's the best propagule to use? And up until this point, I've been talking about bare root plants. You order from the nursery, they arrive in April, late April, you plant them out, and then they start fruiting later on in the summer into the fall. But we were wondering, is there a way to kind of get a jump on that and not kind of, I don't want to say waste, but get some production during those earlier months of say June and July. So we ordered our plants to come in February, and then we planted them in these plug trays and put them in a greenhouse for a couple of months, and then planted them out into our plastic beds. So they had a couple of months head start on what they would have had in the field. So here are our plants. In this case here, they were in pots, started them early in February, and then planted them into the field. And here you can see a picture of, in this row, these are the ones that we started in the greenhouse. And in this row right here, right next to it, are the ones that were just bare root. So we can compare the bare root to the greenhouse grown plug plants. And as you would expect, the ones started in the greenhouse were much more fruitful and productive than those that were just planted in the open. I mean, the ones that were planted in the open, they didn't really get started until July, producing lots of fruit. But the ones that were started in the greenhouse, planted those out, they were already, producing a lot of fruit by the end of June. So it made a big difference. The other thing we thought, well, if that works, what if we planted the plants in the fall? If we could get plug plants and plant them in the fall, maybe they would do even better. So this experiment here, we had the normal dormant crowns planted in spring. We had what we call early start plants. Those are the ones that we started in the greenhouse and then planted in the field at a couple of different times. Then we had plug plants. These are plants that are rooted runner plants, and we plant them in the fall, like August, September, and then see what they do in the following spring. And the difference was pretty remarkable. The plug plants really outperformed even the ones we started in the greenhouse early. So this purple line here are the plug plants. These are planted the previous fall. In both years, really outperformed all the other plants. So it's been hard to get plug plants in the past at that time of the year, particularly day neutral plugs for like late August, early September planting. So we made our own, but some of the nurseries now are starting to produce plug plants for northern climates. So they're available in late August and early September. And you don't have to look at these bar charts, but just look over here where we have our yields, and you can see the plug plants, outperformed the controls by quite a bit. Almost as the early starts were pretty good too. And we look at another year, and again, the plug plants outperform the early start plants and the controls. So I think one of the keys to doing this is actually getting those plants off to a faster start than you would if you just planted them directly into the field in late April or early May. Then we want to take a deeper dive into the various coverings that are out there. And most people use like a clear plastic. But we also connected with this outfit out in France that produces this rose-colored or pink-covered plastic. And you say, what's that do? Well, what it does is it shifts those wavelengths of light from the infrared, which normally produces heat, into the visible wavelength range where the plants can use it. So it actually enhances light under those pink covers because it's taking some of the light that would normally be coming down in the form of heat wavelengths and converting it into visible wavelengths that the plants can use. So we wanted to see how the strawberries would perform under those conditions. And then we also looked at some reflective coverings. These are sort of what people use for greenhouse shading. And what it is like a mesh, and it has reflective strips running through that mesh. And maybe right here in the foreground, you can kind of see a little bit. I'll show you some close-ups in a second. But you can see it's like a mesh, and it has these little reflective strips running through it. And you can put those strips at various distances apart and affect the amount of light that comes through. So we looked at reflected coverings that reflected 30, 40, and 50% of the light away from the plants. Then we had to control. So here's a close-up of some of these reflective strips. You can see it's a mesh, but then you have these strips in here at various densities, and that reflects the light. So the theory was it'll keep the plants cooler in the summertime because it reflected away light, but it has this mesh on here too, which keeps out the tarnished plant bugs. And because we found out earlier that as long as there's some air movement, the plants pollinate, we didn't have to worry about excluding the bees. And so we put these covers on both greenhouse grown plants and plants that were bare root straight into the field. And look here. Let's look at this one. This is that pinkish colored material. On those greenhouse grown plants, it did really well. Shifting the light spectra into the visible range, the yields were pretty high. The other treatment that was pretty high were these reflective shade covers. They did really well too, particularly in the greenhouse grown plants. No plastic, again, yields are lower. And again, this is just sort of looking at the same thing again, looking at marketable, unmarketable fruit, but the shading, as long as it wasn't too much, like when you get to 50% shade, that's a lot of shade. We don't want that much, but when we're at 60, 70% shade, enough to cool the plants, keep out the tarnished plant bugs, the yields are pretty good. In the same way with this rose-colored plastic, it did pretty well too, because the light levels were increased and the heat was reduced because those wavelengths aren't coming in as heat now, they're coming in as visible light. And again, this just summarizes the yield, 50% light, 60% light, 70% light. As long as they were greenhouse grown plants and big to start with, even the 50% light didn't reduce yield that much. When we had small plants to begin with, from the bare rooted plants, the 50% light was a little bit too much, but 60, 70% yields are pretty good. So I think these kind of fabrics have potential. You know, what we did was we had these fabrics under one layer, and then we had a little bit of regular plastic at the top that we just kept it up. And whenever it was going to rain real hard or get cold, we could pull the regular plastic down over top of the reflective covers and provide some protection and just pull them up again. And these elastic strips here, these little elastic ropes, help hold the plastic in place. And here's a close-up of what this looks like with the mesh interlaced with its reflective strips. And let's look underneath, looking up, see what it's like from the plant's point of view. A little shady in there, maybe not as much light, but it's a good environment for the plants to produce fruit. And here we are a few years ago, but this is our harvest on November 10th. Looking pretty good for that time of the year. So what can we conclude? Albion, while it's an older variety, still does well and has great flavor, and that's the one most of our growers are using. Starting plants in a greenhouse early or plugs can make a big difference in their performance. And I think as time goes on, these plug plants will become more and more available commercially for planting up north. And then reducing light transmission to cool the temperature seems to boost production, particularly on plastic mulch, which tends to raise the temperature. Having some shade on there then reduces it and makes it a little bit better for the plants. Then, of course, you sell them, and is it economical or not? I just looked at the website of our local grocery store yesterday, and the organic strawberries were selling for $6 a pound, and the conventional ones for $4 a pound. Let's just go with the $4 number for right now and do some economics. The tunnel materials are pretty expensive, you know, $39,000 for an acre. But if you get about £1 per plant, and you get $4 a pound for it. And this is a conventional price. This is the break-even price. This is the income, and this is the expense, taking into account mulching and plants and fertilizers and laborers and harvests and containers and all that. So bottom line is, it looks like if you get a reasonable yield of about £1 a plant, you can pay for all your stuff that first year. And in the second year, you don't have to buy the tunnel materials because you already bought it. So it seems to me like when we pencil it out, it looks good to grow these day neutral strawberries because you get a bunch of income that first year and you can pay for things and then you're good to go after that. So sort of to wrap up, here's what we now know. Plant early as possible. We recommend white plastic mulch. The other thing I didn't mention was we pinched the flowers for a few weeks after planting just to give those plants a little bit of a chance to get established when we're using bare root plants. It seems to help. 5 pounds per acre of nitrogen per week. Remove the runners. Cover the plantings once flowering begins. Lower the sides during heavy rain. If you're going to overwinter them, remove the flowers after October 15th. Remove straw in early April. And then that kind of will give you fruit for lots of months of the year. We've also, taken this out to growers and had them try it and get feedback from growers. Here are the biggest negatives from growers. It's for a lot of them, they're already busy. They already have a portfolio of crops, and then you're giving them a crop like this that needs attention every week, either fertilizing or picking. It's really hard to fit in another crop where I have to pay a lot of attention to. So that's just something to keep in mind. And then the nutrient management, I mentioned that earlier. Really, the root systems are very, very shallow. They don't go out and find nutrients. It's just really restricted root system. So you have to spoon feed them nitrogen during the season to keep that production up. And again, just some pictures from this time of the year from our fields. We've brought in buyers from local supermarkets to show them our experiments. Had field days. But I would say it's one of those things where the earlier you are in your farming career, the easier it is to adopt day neutral strawberries, and then you can build as you expand and grow, you can build it around the day neutrals. If you already have a full operation, you got lots of things going, it's hard to get a grower like that to adopt day neutral strawberries, even though it pencils out that it's beneficial and favorable. So I think that's all my slides. I'll stop the sharing and see if people have questions or ask Morgan to read some questions that might have come in.
Yes, we have a few questions already in the chat. First, you touched on a few different kinds of plastic. Have you ever tried red plastic?
No, we have not tried red plastic. So I can't comment on that.
That's okay. Another question is, can you further explain what a plug plant is? What is it? How do you grow it?
Yeah, that's a great question if you don't know. So when you grow a regular strawberry, like a June bearing strawberry, a short day strawberry, typically you get plants that you plant in the springtime. Those plants make runners and fill in a row, so you get a matted row. And then those plants go through the winter and flower and fruit in the spring because they've been exposed to short days during the fall. Plug plants are plants, they're runner plants from those first year plants, but they're grown to be large enough so that they can be planted directly into the field in late August or September. So the way these are normally produced is the nursery will put regular June bearing plants, in this case day neutral plants, in like gutters in a greenhouse to give them a heavy early start. And then those plants will produce runners. Those runners are clipped, stuck in a little plug tray and misted until they root. And then you can plant those directly into the field. And usually in the past, the nurseries have only had those plants available like in October, and that's too late for us. But now I know like North started producing some of these for earlier planting for northern growers. And the advantage is you don't have to deal with weeds or anything that whole first year because you're only planting in the fall and you're planting late enough that you're not getting stimulation to make runners. So you plant them in like I'm saying fall is like late August, early September. They're not being stimulated to make runners. You don't have to deal with weeds or anything that whole first year. And yet they still get that exposure to short days and cold temperatures. So they will flower right away in the springtime. You don't have to do any, they've done all their growth. They're ready to go in the spring. So it saves time. And so many growers are looking to plugs now to avoid some of those issues they have in that first year of growing plants when there's lots of weeds.
Thank you for explaining that more. How early do you place the fine mesh cover? Do you put that over, do you put the row cover over top of the fine mesh cover so that both are in place?
So when we put our covers on, we do it once the plants start to flower. There's no real reason to do it earlier than that. But once the plants start to flower, then we put the covers on to start to moderate the temperature and exclude the tarnished plant bugs. Um, so that's the time. So we would put the mesh down first and then the plastic on top of that. And the mesh then would stay down all year long. You'd only raise it when you go in and pick the fruit and put it back down again. And the plastic on the top can open and close depending on the temperature and the rain and things like that.
For growers who might be interested in purchasing the hoops and covers, do you have any sources to share that you use in your projects or other reputable sources?
Yeah, there's an outfit out of Quebec, Canada that most people are getting their hoops from. It's called Ag Renovation, I believe is the name of it. Ag Innovation. And they do a really nice job of providing the whole kit. So they'll provide you with the plastic, the metal hoops, the bungee cords for holding it down, and it's pretty reasonable in price. Ag Renovation, I believe is the name of it.
Okay. And for those that are listening, I've given everyone the ability to unmute. So go ahead and unmute or raise your hand if you have questions, but I'll also keep watching the Q&A if you prefer to type it out. We have a question about how you discussed treating strawberries as annuals versus overwintering. It seems like the second year of growth is the highest production. So in South Dakota, do we overwinter the first year and then remove at the end of the season?
Yeah, I think that's something you'll have to kind of experiment with and find out what works for you. You can get pretty high yields that second year, but you also have the risk of more winter injury and a long winter where the plants don't recover. So it's really hard for me to predict and say that's the way it has to be or that's the way it should be. I think you could try and find out. And if it's not working out, you haven't really lost much. The system is still in place. You can recover that. All you've really lost is a little bit of time. So if it were me and I were starting out, I would plant my day neutrals and then I would fruit them that year. I would let that field over winter the second year, but in that second year, I'd also plant another crop of day neutrals, just assuming that I might have to do it as an annual and see how they overwinter. And my guess is it's really going to depend on the year because our winters have been so variable. And so maybe when you get the results one year, you say, oh, they overwintered great. Then the next year you try, they don't overwinter so well. So it's hard to predict those things.
Can you share about your irrigation methods during your project?
Yeah, we use simple drip irrigation. We run a drip irrigation line down the middle of the staggered double row. So the irrigation line runs right in the middle. And then we have the ability to fertigate. So we put the fertilizer in and it runs down the row between the plants and drips. Some growers, not so much here, but when you go to other parts of the country, they'll use beds that are even wider, like 4 rows wide. And in that case, you have to use 2 drip lines per row. But in our case, you just have to use one. So it's pretty simple. It's a standard drip irrigation system. And because we're on plastic, we can't really use overhead. And we really wouldn't want to anyway because we want to avoid wetting the fruit and the flowers. So the drip works great for that.
Greg, it looks like you have your hand up, so go ahead.
Yes, thanks. I don't use plastic in growing anything, but I have used cardboard strips by those rolls, Marvin.
Uh-huh.
Lay that down, then I'll put 3 or 4 inch thick layer of compost, and then I would put heavy straw over that, like 8 inches thick or so. And then I have a pot of putki, one of those planting things you can stand up and put your plants in if you greenhouse grow them. And so
Okay.
I can dig right through the straw and plant through all that. But have you ever seen anybody use a system similar to that without using plastic to prevent weeds?
No, I haven't. I've seen the cardboard and I've seen the straw separately, but I haven't seen them two together like that. So yeah, if that works, that's great. I should say, with the plastic, it's you can do that organically as long as you take the plastic off. So it's not prohibited, but unless maybe South Dakota has specific regulations against using plastic. I know in New York you can use it uh, like it's an annual, then you take it up again. But what you're doing, Greg, is perfectly fine organically, and if it keeps the weeds down, great. Um, the only thing I would see that maybe is a little bit of a drawback is that the root system is going to warm up more slowly. So the plants might be lagging a little bit over plants that would be in plastic.
Yeah.
You mentioned creating plug plants when they were not available earlier in your research. Can you talk a little bit more about that
We
process?
did that, yeah. So we ordered regular bare root plants and planted them in the pots in the greenhouse. And my guess is we did that probably March or April. And then we just grew them in the greenhouse. At warm temperatures are fine. We don't want them to flower and fruit. We pinch the flowers off, and that stimulates runner production. And then the runners grow out over the pots and hang down, or you can do it in a gutter. And then you clip those runner tips off and stick them into a plug. So they have these little like anchor roots that come up when they're runners, and you just stick those in and then mist them, and they grow roots. And then before too long, you have a little rooted strawberry plant in a plug. And those can be transplanted out into the field and usually sometime in September for us. And then they'll flower and fruit in the spring. And they'll get a big jump on the plants that you start later. So it's a pretty simple process. It's just you have to have a facility to do it to get them started a little bit earlier than they normally would in the field. And you can put when you cut those root tips off, you can put them in a plastic bag with a little bit of like a moist paper towel and just put them in the refrigerator, and they'll last a week or so in there. And then so you can accumulate and then do your sticking of the runner tips all at one time instead of doing a little bit every day. And it just saves time to do it that way.
Any other questions?
Anything else, Morgan? Otherwise, I have just one closing comment.
I'd like
Um,
to know how many people have tried day neutrals or have had some experience with it. So apparently Greg has, but other people
yeah.
on the call, has anyone had experience? And maybe they could share just a little bit about what they do. Looks like it might be new for most people. There's Kimberly. No,
Ross,
that's Ross. I'm sorry.
Ross, go ahead.
Yeah, so this is my first year. So I did it in a 16 by 100 caterpillar tunnel, which is a little bit taller than what you were talking about there.
Mm-hmm.
I fit 11 rows in there, so I did a double row and then 3 triples. I had a drip line per row just because I didn't know if that was going to be enough splitting the difference.
Uh-huh.
Um, the hardest part that we found was trying to find a picking strategy that worked for us, you know. So like we ended up having to pick 3 times a week, and I only had a market on the weekends, so we had to try to find outlets for the berries during the week. But there's a lot of berries in 1,100 plants.
Yeah.
So we did 900 of those were Albion, and then 200 were Monterey. And I would definitely lean towards the Albion again. Um, and then so like my decision right now is trying to figure out if I should rip these out and start over or um, try to overwinter them in that tunnel.
Yeah.
Because it's a strong enough tunnel that the snow would stay off of it.
Yeah. Like I say, I think it's really hard to predict until you try it a couple of times and see what works. The New Hampshire people that are collaborators in New Hampshire, they're sold on overwintering the plants. I haven't been based on our experience. So, and you would think they might be a little bit colder than New York, but I'm not sure. Seems pretty similar to me. So they've had a different experience than we've had.
Someone else shared in the chat that they don't have much experience, but they have a restaurant. And like you mentioned in the beginning, it's hard to find strawberries long term for more than just a couple of weeks.
So they should get together with Ross. And then you can have strawberries all summer and Ross can have a market. No, seriously, that's how this works. Partnering up farms with farm to table. We have
Y-
not had I've not had any day neutral growers complain about not having a market for their fruit. It seems like between farmers markets and roadside stands and so forth, it goes. The challenge would be that if you try to market pick your own, it doesn't work because people don't believe it that you have local strawberries in August. And they're starting to think about apples and things like that. But these other outlets seem to still work pretty well if you can have multiple places to sell them to.
I do have a question on shelf life. So picking these obviously, or my experience, they don't last as long as your store-bought shipped ones. Like you need to eat them fresh or use them. Did you guys test any of that?
Yeah, so the reason they don't last as long is because you pick them when they taste good and they're ripe. That's what the California strawberries are picked, a few days before they're fully ripe. And then they're packaged in such a way that they wrap the pallets and inject carbon dioxide in there, which allows the plants to turn red, or the fruit to turn red, but doesn't add any more sugar to it. And so it's just a way of extending the shelf life as they ship them across the country. So undoubtedly, when you pick those strawberries and they're nice and ripe, they taste great, but they're not going to last as long. What you can do, and you can cool them as quickly as you can, um, and keep them cold. But you can't really compete with the shelf life of California. Well, if you pick them early and do what California does, then they're not going to taste as good. So that takes away your marketing edge. But cooling is like, I don't know if you do, if you have the ability to cool those plant or those fruits right after they're harvested.
We've been picking just the morning of the market and taking them straight to market. So it's early mornings, but
Yeah.
I didn't know if taking it the field heat to cooling to back outside in the heat in the summer, like your July, August, if that was gonna alter the product.
Yeah. So that if you cool the fruit and then you take it outside like hours later, a day or two later, you get condensation on the fruit from the humidity in the air, condensing that fruit until that fruit warms up. And that can decrease your shelf life because then you have water on the fruit and it can, stimulate mold development and so forth. So you really have to make sure that the consumer gets that fruit when it's still kind of cool, and then let them take it home and deal with it. But if you cool it and then leave it out for a while, the fruit's going to get wet.
I do just want to note that for producers like Ross, or if anyone else is either a restaurant or something looking for a large quantity, or a producer that has more than they know what to do with, our organization does have a few different avenues to connect producers with buyers, both on our website and some other groups that we have. And so if you're ever wondering about that, feel free to send me an email or visit our website, um, just as we're talking about that. It doesn't look like there's any other questions. So thank you again for joining us and sharing.
Sure.
This was a really great webinar. And I just want to thank everyone who took the time to join us too. As you exit the webinar, there is going to be a short post survey that pops up in your browser. Or if you're watching the recording, it's in the caption. We would really appreciate your responses. It helps us to plan future events and complete our required reporting. So thank you, everybody. Have a good day.